Caitlin Clark walked into her Team USA Senior National Team debut and instantly turned the entire event into a global headline. What should have been a normal first appearance became something much bigger, because in limited minutes, she put together the kind of performance that forces people to stop whatever they're doing and pay attention. She came off the bench, controlled the pace, stretched the floor, created easy offense for everyone around her, and put up numbers that had people digging through the record books almost immediately. And that is why the reaction to the next game became so intense. Because after a debut that felt historic, a lot of fans expected Team USA to lean even more into what Clark brought to the floor. Instead, the conversation after the Puerto Rico game went in a completely different direction. That is where the controversy really started. It was not just about box scores or highlights. It was about the feeling that something clearly changed from one game to the next. In her debut, Clark looked like the engine of the offense the moment she stepped onto the court. The ball moved, the floor opened up, teammates got easier looks, and the overall rhythm felt fast, sharp, and organized. It was the kind of debut that made people wonder how quickly Team USA might just hand her more control. The numbers only made that reaction louder. The scoring was impressive, the assists stood out even more, and the 0 turnovers made the whole thing look even cleaner. Fans were not just watching a nice first game. They were watching what felt like immediate proof that Clark's style translated to the international stage without any hesitation at all. That is why the next game was so jarring for people. Against Puerto Rico, the offense looked different, the flow felt different, and the overall energy around Clark's involvement was noticeably lower. And once that happened, the internet did what it always does with a player as polarizing and as watched as Caitlin Clark. Every possession got clipped, slowed down, replayed, debated, and turned into evidence for whatever side people already wanted to believe. Some fans thought it was just a rougher game against a tougher effort from the opponent. Others saw something more intentional. They saw a team and a coaching staff stepping away from a very player who had just made the previous game feel electric. Part of the reason this blew up so quickly is because the debut itself was not treated like a normal debut. The reaction inside the arena, online, and across media coverage made it obvious that Clark was the central attraction. There was real buzz in the building. The crowd responded differently when she touched the ball. Cameras followed her constantly. The entire atmosphere seemed to rise every time she got involved in transition or started creating off the dribble. That kind of presence matters, because once a player clearly becomes the focus of the event, people become even more sensitive to anything that looks like that player is being minimized. And that is what fueled so much of the anger after Puerto Rico. Fans felt like they had already seen what Team USA looked like when the offense flowed through Clark's pace, vision, and spacing. They had already seen how quickly she could bend the defense, how easily she could create for scorers running the floor, and how the game seemed to open up when she was given freedom to organize things. So when next performance looked slower, more disconnected, and more resistant to putting the ball back in her hands consistently, people immediately started asking why. A big part of the discussion centered on Angel Reese, because several possessions stood out to fans watching the game closely. Clark appeared open more than once, and instead of the easy pass coming her way, the ball went elsewhere where the possession got forced into something tighter and less natural. On their own, 1 or 2 misreads would not mean much. Basketball is fast, mistakes happen, and not every misconnection is some deeper issue. But when people already feel like there is tension, and then they watch multiple possessions where Clark looks available and does not get rewarded, those moments start to carry more weight than they otherwise would. That is exactly what happened here. Online reaction focused hard on those sequences. Fans started compiling clips. They started comparing how quickly Clark moved the ball when others were open against how often she seemed to get overlooked when she was in good position herself. The more those clips circulated, the more people convinced themselves that this was not random at all. Then there was a sequence with unnecessary-looking contact that only made things worse. Once it got clipped and spread around, the mood online shifted from frustration to suspicion. Suddenly, what could have been seen as a sloppy team game turned into another chapter in the already loaded Caitlin Clark conversation. That is what makes Clark coverage so intense right now. Nothing around her stays small. A great performance becomes a referendum on women's basketball popularity. A quiet stretch becomes a debate about jealousy, politics, or team dynamics. A missed pass becomes a full-blown social media trial. That is not always fair, but it is a reality when one player is carrying this much attention. Clark is not just being watched as a rookie star or a skill point guard. She is being watched as a symbol, and once that happens, every detail gets magnified. What really pushed the discussion into overdrive, though, was the post-game press conference. Kara Lawson did not come out and say anything dramatic in blunt terms, but fans heard enough in her answers to feel like their suspicions had been confirmed. Her comments about the game being uneven, about the team still figuring things out, and about everybody adjusting different roles may sound ordinary on paper. Coaches say things like that all the time, but because those comments came right after a game in which Clark's influence appeared more controlled and less central, people interpreted them through that lens. Then the bigger reaction came from the sense that Lawson wanted balance, experimentation, and shared opportunity rather than allowing the hottest player from the previous game to keep driving the entire show. That is where the everyone should shine reaction really took off. Fans heard that concept and did not take it as harmless coaching language. They took it as a direct response to Clark's explosion in the first game. From their perspective, the message sounded like this. Clark had just stolen the entire spotlight, and now the staff wanted to make sure the next game looked more spread out, more democratic, more even, whether that was truly Lawson's intention or not. That is how the audience heard it. And because Clark's supporters were already upset with how little rhythm she seemed to get against Puerto Rico, those words hit like gasoline on a fire. What made the backlash even stronger was a visible contrast between the starting group and the way the offense looked once Clark entered. The starting lineup did not have the same tempo. The ball movement felt more ordinary. The attack looked more methodical and less threatening. Then Clark came in, and the pace visibly lifted. That difference stood out immediately to people who had watched the first game. They felt like they were seeing the same thing all over again. Team USA looked more dynamic when Clark was allowed to play her natural style, and more limited when she was treated like just another piece rather than the organizer of the action. Puerto Rico's defensive approach also added another layer to the discussion. Fans noticed that the opponent clearly respected Clark's impact. There were stretches where the defense looked built around making her life harder, keeping the ball away from her, and forcing others to initiate. That mattered, because it fed one of the biggest reactions from Clark supporters. The idea that the opposing team seemed more committed to taking her seriously than her own side did, whether that is a fair conclusion or not. It is easy to understand why that perception took hold. When a defense bends its shape around one player, but her own offense does not seem eager to feature her, people are going to notice. And honestly, that is the core why the story got so loud. It is not just that Clark had a great debut, and then a quieter second game. Players have swings like that all the time. It is that the first game felt like proof of concept. It felt like evidence that when Clark is allowed to run the show, the offense becomes sharper, faster, and harder to guard. So when the very next game looked like an effort to spread the spotlight around, it felt to many fans like a step backward on purpose. Again, that is interpretation, not a confirmed plan, but it explains why the reaction was so emotional. There is also the broader Clark factor that cannot be ignored. She changes the temperature of every environment she enters. Crowds respond to her. Cameras track her. Media coverage expands around her. People who do not normally follow women's basketball start talking when she is involved. That influence is real, and everyone in the sport knows it. So when a player with that kind of gravity also happens to play a style that instantly improves pace and spacing, the expectation becomes even stronger that a coach should lean into it. That is why any decision that looks like restraint gets treated not as a basketball choice, but as something personal or political. Whether that is fair to Lawson is another question. Coaches do experiment. They do mix units. They do try to get multiple players comfortable in different roles, especially in short tournament settings. And a coach absolutely has a right to think beyond one hot performance if the long-term goal is building a full team identity. That is the strongest argument on the other side. But even if you grant all of that, it still does not erase how stark the contrast looked from Game 1 to Game 2. Clark made the offense feel alive in her debut. And in the Puerto Rico game, there were stretches where it felt like that energy was being actively diluted. That is why so many Fever fans came away from the whole thing not discouraged, but oddly reassured. They watched Clark thrive the moment she had freedom, and then they watched how different everything looked when that freedom got reduced. For them, the lesson was simple. Clark does not need endless debate to prove what kind of impact she has. The difference is visible when she is allowed to push pace, pull defenders out, and fire passes into openings before anyone else sees them. The offense changes. When she is treated more cautiously or used more sparingly as the main creator, the game slows down and loses some of its edge. That is the part that matters most going forward. All of this noise around Team USA, the lineup choices, the looked-off possessions, the press conference answers, the crowd reaction, all of it circles back to the same basketball truth. Clark raises the offensive ceiling when she is empowered to play the way she naturally plays. That is why people were so blown away by the debut, and that is why they were so irritated by the follow-up. The first game looked like possibility. The second game looked like hesitation. In the end, that is why the Puerto Rico reaction became so huge. It was not just about one missed pass or one odd lineup choice. It was about contrast. One night, Clark looked like the center of something historic. The next night, it looked like that very thing was being toned down. Fans saw the difference, and they were not subtle about it. They believed the offense was better when she was trusted. They believed the atmosphere was bigger because she was there. They believed even the opponent understood her value. And once they felt her own side was not leaning into that reality, the controversy was guaranteed. So whether you think Carl Lawson was simply experimenting, whether you think Angel Reese just had a few bad reads, or whether you think the whole thing reflected something more deliberate, one thing is obvious. Caitlin Clark's presence changes everything around her, and when that impact appears limited, people notice immediately. That is not hype anymore. That is the standard she has created.